Most home invaders break a window. They pry open a back door in the dead of night, grab what they can, and run. But the person who wanted to steal absolutely everything from Martha didn't pick a lock. She walked right through the front door, carrying a warm, homemade apple pie, and called her mom. For 40 years, Martha worked as a forensic accountant for the IRS. She spent her life tracking hidden assets, offshore accounts, and paper trails left by desperate people. She had a simple rule: people lie, numbers don't. But nothing in her 4 decades of unmasking corporate fraud could have prepared her for the predator sitting at her own Thanksgiving table. Martha was 65 years old. 2 years ago, she lost her husband, Robert, to a sudden heart attack. His death left a massive void in the sprawling 4-bedroom house they had built together in the quiet suburbs of Virginia. But the person who took Robert's death the hardest wasn't Martha. It was their only son, David. David was 35, a successful architect, but he was drowning in loneliness. Since his father's passing, David had been desperate to anchor himself, to build a family of his own. He wanted the white picket fence, the Sunday dinners, the noise of children filling up a house. Grief does strange things to the human mind. It creates blind spots. And predators? They don't look for weakness. They look for blind spots. Then, out of nowhere, David's life lit up. He met Chloe. According to David, Chloe was a miracle. She was 30 years old, a pediatric nurse who spent her days taking care of sick children. She volunteered at animal shelters. She baked from scratch. She was the kind of woman who seemed to step right out of a 1950s catalog, sweet, attentive, and entirely devoted to David. Martha finally met Chloe on Thanksgiving Day. When David walked her through the front door, Chloe was holding a perfectly lattice-crusted apple pie. She hugged Martha, a little too tight, a little too long, and said, "David has told me so much about you. I feel like I already know you." Through dinner, Chloe played her part flawlessly. She complimented Martha's cooking. She asked questions about Robert, showing just the right amount of empathy, her eyes welling up with perfectly timed tears. She rested her hand gently on David's arm, looking at him with absolute adoration. David was glowing. Martha hadn't seen her son smile like this in 2 years. She wanted to be happy for him. She really did. But Martha was an auditor. Her brain was wired to look for anomalies, and something about Chloe felt rehearsed. It wasn't anything obvious. It was the micro-expressions. When David turned his back to get more wine, Chloe's warm, glowing smile dropped for a fraction of a second, leaving a cold, calculating stare scanning the expensive artwork on the dining room walls. It was the way she asked casual questions that were just a little too specific. "This house is so beautiful, Martha. Do you manage the upkeep all by yourself now?" David mentioned Robert was an executive. "Did he leave you a lot of paperwork to deal with?" Martha gave polite, vague answers. She told herself she was just being a protective, paranoid mother. She was letting her career infect her personal life. Until after dessert. As they drank coffee in the living room, David excitedly announced their plans. He and Chloe were looking to buy a house together. "We're putting our finances together to see what kind of mortgage we can get," David said. Chloe actually brought some of her paperwork. "Mom, since you used to do this for a living, do you mind taking a quick look?" Chloe smiled shyly and pulled a neat manila folder from her designer tote bag. "I'm terrible with numbers, Martha. I'd be so grateful if you just glanced at it. Make sure I have everything the bank needs." It was a brilliant psychological move. By handing over her financial documents voluntarily, Chloe was establishing ultimate trust. She was saying, "I have nothing to hide." Martha put on her reading glasses and opened the folder. Inside were 2 months of bank statements and a W-2 tax form from a regional hospital in Maryland. At first glance, it looked perfect. The income matched the typical salary of a registered nurse. The savings account showed a responsible balance of $45,000. But Martha didn't look at documents like a normal person. She looked at them like a federal investigator. Her eyes caught the employer identification number at the top of the W-2. The spacing between the digits was slightly off. The font used for Chloe's Social Security number wasn't standard Courier or Arial. It was a microscopic fraction of a millimeter thicker than the surrounding text. And then there was the financial footprint. Chloe claimed she had been a nurse for 6 years, living independently, yet her bank statements showed no auto payments for student loans, no long-term 401k contributions. The transaction history was remarkably clean. Too clean. It didn't look like the messy, everyday financial life of a 30-year-old woman. It looked like a profile created 3 months ago. Martha closed the folder. She handed it back with a polite smile. "Looks very organized, dear," she said smoothly. "I'm sure the bank will have no issues." Chloe beamed. David kissed her cheek. But beneath the table, Martha's hands were entirely cold. That night, David and Chloe stayed over in the guest bedroom down the hall. By 3 a.m., the house was dead silent. Outside, a light winter rain hit the window panes. Martha lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was racing, turning the image of that W-2 form over and over in her head. She tried to convince herself she was overthinking it. Maybe the hospital used cheap accounting software. Maybe Chloe was just incredibly frugal. At 3:14 a.m., the silence was broken by a sharp buzz on her nightstand. Martha grabbed her phone. The screen cast a harsh blue light across her face. It was an automated text message from Vanguard, the brokerage firm holding her and Robert's retirement accounts. An account holding over $1.2 million. The message read, "Security alert. A request to reset your master password has been initiated. If this was not you, please secure your account immediately." Martha sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Someone was trying to break into her life savings. Her initial thought was identity theft. A hacker half a world away, running a brute force attack on her email. She immediately logged into her Vanguard app using her biometric ID to lock the account down. Then, using her background in cyber auditing, she pulled up the recent security logs on her account portal to trace the origin of the login attempt. She expected to see an IP address from Russia, Nigeria, or some encrypted proxy server. The screen loaded. The IP address of the unauthorized login attempt appeared. Martha stared at the string of numbers. Her blood turned to ice. She didn't need to run a trace. She recognized the IP address instantly. It wasn't coming from overseas. It was a local IP. Specifically, it was the IP address assigned by her own dual-band Wi-Fi router. The hack wasn't happening from across the world. The call was coming from inside the house. Someone had connected to her home network, waited until 3 a.m., and was currently sitting in the dark, actively trying to breach her multi-million-dollar retirement fund. Martha slowly lowered her phone. She looked toward her bedroom door. Down the hallway, just 50 feet away, her son was fast asleep. And lying right next to him was the sweet, perfect, pie-baking pediatric nurse. Chloe wasn't looking for a family. She was running an active heist, and she had already bypassed the front door. The hardest thing Martha ever had to do in her 65 years of life was walk into her kitchen the next morning and pour a cup of coffee. When she came downstairs, the house smelled of vanilla and butter. Chloe was standing at the stove, humming softly as she flipped pancakes. David was sitting at the kitchen island, looking at her with absolute adoration. "Good morning, Mom," David said, his voice bright. Chloe insisted on making breakfast. Chloe turned around, offering a warm, flawless smile. "I hope you like blueberry, Martha. I noticed you had some fresh ones in the fridge." Martha looked at the young woman holding a spatula. Just hours ago, this exact same woman was sitting in the dark, typing algorithms into a smartphone, trying to crack the firewall of Martha's life savings. The urge to scream, to grab her son by the shoulders and tell him to run, was almost suffocating. But Martha was a veteran of the IRS. She had spent decades building cases against white-collar criminals who were experts at destroying evidence the second they felt heat. If she accused Chloe now, without concrete proof, Chloe would simply deny it. She would cry. She would play the victim. And David, blinded by grief and love, would take her side. Martha would be painted as the paranoid, grieving mother trying to ruin her son's happiness. So Martha did what an investigator does best. She smiled back. "Blueberry sounds wonderful, dear," Martha said smoothly, taking a sip of her black coffee. Thank you. She played the part of the happy future mother-in-law for the rest of the weekend. But the moment David and Chloe packed up their car and drove back to the city on Sunday evening, Martha went straight to her home office and locked the door. She opened her safe, pulled out a secure encrypted laptop she kept from her consulting days, and made a phone call. She didn't call the police. The police wouldn't care about a failed login attempt on a home Wi-Fi network. They'd call it a glitch. She needed someone who dealt in the shadows of the digital world. She called Marcus. Marcus was a former FBI cybercrimes analyst who had transitioned into private intelligence. He was the kind of guy corporations paid top dollar to find out who was embezzling millions through crypto wallets. He owed Martha a favor from an old joint task force case 10 years ago. "You don't call me on a Sunday night unless the numbers are bleeding, Martha," Marcus said when he picked up. "I have a target," Martha replied, her voice deadpan. "She's operating inside my house. I need a full background scrub, and I need it completely off the books." Martha hadn't just looked at Chloe's W-2 form the night before. She was a forensic accountant. Her brain was trained to absorb numerical data like a sponge. She recited the exact Social Security number, the employer identification number, and the home address printed on Chloe's paperwork from memory. "Give me 48 hours, Marcus said. The next 2 days were pure psychological torture. David called Martha twice, talking excitedly about the houses he and Chloe were touring. He talked about how Chloe wanted a big backyard for a dog, how she was already looking at paint colors for a nursery. Every word out of her son's mouth felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Martha had to force herself to sound supportive, biting her tongue so hard it almost bled. On Tuesday afternoon, Marcus called back. His tone had completely changed. The casual professionalism was gone. "Martha," he said quietly, "where is your son right now?" "At his architecture firm." "Why? What did you find?" There was a heavy pause on the line. "I ran the employment data first," Marcus explained. "The regional hospital in Maryland where Chloe claims to work, they have no record of her. I didn't just check the current payroll. I checked the last 10 years. She has never scrubbed in for a single shift there. The W-2 she showed you is a highly sophisticated forgery. The employer ID number actually belongs to a bankrupt medical supply company that dissolved in 2018. Martha took a deep breath. "And the bank statements?" "The account is real," Marcus said, "but it was opened exactly 90 days ago with a cash deposit. There's no history, no utility bills, no student loans, no digital footprint. But that's not the worst part." Martha gripped the edge of her oak desk. "Tell me." "I ran a skip trace on the Social Security number she printed on that tax form," Marcus continued, the keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. "It didn't bounce back as fake. It's a valid government-issued SSN." "Then who does it belong to?" Martha asked. "It belongs to a girl named Emily," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave. "Emily was born in 1990. And Emily died in a car crash in 1995. Your future daughter-in-law is using the Social Security number of a deceased 5-year-old. The room seemed to spin. Martha sat down heavily in her leather chair. In the financial crime world, this was known as synthetic identity fraud. It was a terrifyingly effective tactic used by organized crime rings. They take a real Social Security number, usually from a deceased child or an undocumented immigrant, and attach a brand new name and date of birth to it. They slowly build a fake credit history over months or years, creating a phantom person who looks perfectly legitimate on paper. "She's a ghost, Martha," Marcus said bluntly. "The woman calling herself Chloe doesn't exist. She has no legal identity, no real past, and no trace. She is a carefully constructed phantom." Martha stared blindly at the wall. This wasn't a desperate gold digger trying to marry into money. This was a professional, calculating predator. A predator who had spent months studying David's vulnerabilities, building a fake persona, and embedding herself into their family. And her goal wasn't just to steal a few $1,000s. She had tried to hack a $1.2 million retirement account on night 1. She was aiming to take everything. "Martha, you need to go to the authorities," Marcus warned. Women who run synthetic identities at this level are not working alone. They are usually part of a syndicate. If she realizes you are looking into her, things could escalate from financial to physical very quickly. "I can't go to the police yet," Martha said, her voice trembling but finding its steel. "If I go to the cops with a fake W-2, she'll just claim she bought it to get a better mortgage rate because of bad credit. She'll spin a sob story. David will bail her out and she will disappear into the wind before I can prove she tried to hack me." "So what's the play?" Marcus asked. "I need to know who she really is. I need to know who she's working with. And I need her real face on a silver platter before I show my son." Martha hung up the phone. She looked at a framed photograph on her desk. David, smiling brightly, standing next to his late father. Her son was in love with a woman who did not exist. He was planning to buy a house with her, to marry her, to give her the legal right to everything he owned, and eventually, everything Martha owned. Martha opened a blank spreadsheet on her computer. She wasn't just a mother protecting her child anymore. She was an auditor who had just found a massive discrepancy, and she was going to tear this ghost apart, number by number. But out in the city, the ghost was already making her next move, and she was about to play a card that Martha never saw coming. Predators possess a terrifying sixth sense. They don't just read documents, they read breathing patterns, they read eye contact. And the next time David and Chloe came over for Sunday dinner, Chloe knew something had shifted. Martha was perfectly polite. She served the roast, she asked about their week, she smiled at all the right times. But to a professional con artist, a flawless performance is a red flag. Chloe realized that the warm, grieving widow she thought she was manipulating had suddenly turned into a brick wall. Martha wasn't asking probing questions anymore. She wasn't asking about Chloe's job at the hospital. She was simply observing. Chloe understood immediately that she was being hunted. And in the world of synthetic identity fraud, when a target becomes a threat, you don't run. You neutralize them. You don't attack their physical safety. You attack their credibility. The psychological warfare began on a Tuesday afternoon. Martha received a frantic phone call from David. He was at his architecture firm, his voice trembling with panic. "Mom, are you okay? Chloe just called me at work. She said you called her in tears, asking why Dad hadn't come home from the hardware store yet." Martha froze. The phone felt heavy in her hand. Her husband, Robert, had been dead for 2 years. "David, I never made that call," Martha said, her voice sharp and clear. "I've been at the grocery store for the past hour." "Mom, she showed me the call log on her phone," David pleaded, the heartbreak evident in his voice. "She said you sounded completely lost. Are you sure you didn't mix up your medication?" It was a brilliant, devastating strike. Chloe hadn't just faked a phone call. She was planting the seeds of a terrifying narrative. Early onset dementia. Over the next 3 weeks, the campaign of gaslighting escalated with surgical precision. Whenever Chloe was at the house, things began to happen. Martha's car keys would vanish from the entryway table, only to be found hours later at the bottom of the kitchen trash can. Important mail, including Martha's property tax bills, would simply disappear. One evening, David came over to find Martha's prescription blood pressure medication sitting inside the refrigerator next to the milk. Martha knew she hadn't done any of these things. She lived alone. Her routine was immaculate, but every time David witnessed one of these episodes, Chloe was right there beside him, holding his hand, her eyes welling up with perfectly rehearsed, compassionate tears. "It's happening just like it did with my grandmother, David," Chloe whispered one night in the hallway, making sure her voice was just loud enough for Martha to hear from the living room. The confusion, the misplaced items, the denial. "We can't be angry with her. She's sick. We need to protect her." Martha sat in her armchair, her fingernails digging into the upholstery. She was an IRS forensic accountant. She had dismantled multi-million-dollar corporate tax evasion schemes. Yet she was being systemically dismantled in her own home by a 30-year-old phantom. If Martha screamed, if she accused Chloe of planting the pills or hiding the keys, she would just look exactly like what Chloe was painting her to be. A paranoid, delusional old woman losing her grip on reality. David was breaking under the emotional weight of it all. He had lost his father, and now he was watching his mother's mind seemingly disintegrate before his eyes. He leaned entirely on Chloe for support. The isolation of Martha was complete. Then the trap snapped shut. It happened on a rainy Saturday morning. David sat Martha down at the kitchen table. He looked exhausted. Chloe sat next to him, her hand resting gently on Martha's arm in a display of sickeningly sweet, fake concern. "Mom, we need to talk about your finances," David said softly. "You have over $1 million in retirement and a paid-off house. With your memory slipping, it's not safe for you to manage it alone anymore. If you forget to pay the property taxes, or if you fall for a scam, you could lose everything." Before Martha could respond, Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. "I actually know a wonderful estate planner, Martha. He works with a lot of the elderly patients at my hospital. He specializes in helping families set up living trusts and power of attorney, just to make sure David can take care of your bills if you have a bad day. We set up a meeting for this afternoon, just to listen." An hour later, there was a knock on the front door. Enter Richard. Richard looked like he had stepped off the cover of Forbes magazine. He wore a tailored navy suit, a platinum Rolex, and carried a leather briefcase. He had silver hair, a warm, reassuring baritone voice, and a smile that exuded absolute competence and trustworthiness. He sat in Martha's living room, speaking gently to David about asset protection, irrevocable trusts, and medical directives. He explained that by granting David full financial power of attorney, Martha would be completely protected. What he didn't say, but what Martha instantly recognized, was that if David had the power of attorney, and David married Chloe, Chloe would have unmitigated legal access to every single penny Martha owned. During the meeting, Martha played her part flawlessly. She let her hands tremble. She looked confused when Richard used legal jargon. She asked him to repeat himself twice. She played the frail, slipping widow to absolute perfection. "This is a lot to process, Richard," Martha said, her voice wavering slightly. "Could you leave your business card? I just need to look at it when my head is a little clearer." "Of course, Martha. Take all the time you need." Richard smiled warmly, handing over a thick, embossed card. "We just want you to feel safe." The second the front door closed behind David, Chloe, and Richard, the trembling in Martha's hands completely stopped. Her posture straightened. She walked into her home office, locked the door, and immediately scanned the business card into her encrypted laptop. She sent the file directly to Marcus, the private investigator. "I have a new player," Martha typed. "Name is Richard. Claims to be an independent estate planner. I want his financial footprint, his corporate filings, everything." It took Marcus less than 24 hours to crack the facade. When he called Martha the next evening, the tension in his voice was palpable. "You aren't dealing with a couple of amateur con artists, Martha," Marcus said grimly. "You have stepped right into the crosshairs of a major syndicate." "Tell me about Richard," Martha demanded. "Richard isn't just an estate planner. He's the architect," Marcus explained. "His real name is Richard Vance. His firm is registered as an LLC in Delaware, heavily shielded by shell companies. I tracked the routing numbers associated with his corporate accounts. The money doesn't stay in the U.S. It gets funneled through real estate holding companies and washes out into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." Martha stared at the glowing screen of her laptop, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping together. "Chloe isn't acting alone," Marcus continued. "She is the operative. Her job is to find wealthy widows or widowers, specifically those with lonely, vulnerable adult children. She seduces the child, embeds herself in the family, and isolates the parent. Once the parent is isolated, she uses psychological abuse to manufacture a medical crisis. When the family is desperate, she introduces Richard as the savior." Martha felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. "And Richard secures the power of attorney." "Exactly," Marcus said. "Once Richard has the legal paperwork, the money is drained legally, no hacking required. By the time the family realizes the accounts are empty, Richard's firm has dissolved, and Chloe has vanished into thin air, ready to pick up a new Social Security number and a new family. Martha looked out her window into the dark, rain-soaked street. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. She wasn't fighting a greedy girlfriend. She was fighting a highly organized, heavily funded criminal network that utilized psychological torture and legal loopholes as their primary weapons. "Martha, you have to pack a bag and leave that house," Marcus urged. "If they realize you are onto them, they won't wait for David to sign the paperwork. People like Richard do not leave loose ends. If you become a liability, they will find a way to make your dementia take a fatal turn." "No," Martha said quietly. The fear in her chest was slowly being replaced by a cold, calculated fury. "Martha, listen to me. I spent 40 years locking up men exactly like Richard," Martha interrupted, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "He thinks I'm a confused old woman with one foot in the grave. He thinks he can use my own son to put me there. He just made the biggest mistake of his life." Martha hung up the phone. She didn't pack a bag. She opened a new spreadsheet. The game of defense was over. It was time to set a trap. There is a specific kind of silence that fills a room right before a bomb goes off. It's heavy. It's thick. You can almost feel it pressing against your eardrums. That was the silence in Martha's dining room on Friday night. Martha had invited David and Chloe over for dinner under the guise of surrender. She had called her son that morning, her voice perfectly mimicking the frail, confused widow Chloe had engineered her to be. She told David that she was tired. She told him that her memory was indeed slipping, and she was finally ready to sign Richard's power of attorney documents to protect the family's future. David had been incredibly relieved. He promised to bring Chloe and celebrate the decision with a nice bottle of wine. He thought his mother was finally getting the help she needed. He had no idea he was walking into an interrogation room. The dinner was a masterclass in deception from both sides. Chloe was radiant, playing the role of the ultimate victor. She poured Martha's wine. She held David's hand. She spoke in that soft, patronizing tone people use with toddlers or the terminally ill. She believed she had won. She believed she had successfully gaslit a 65-year-old woman into handing over the keys to $1 million estate. Martha ate her roast chicken. She chewed slowly. She waited until the plates were cleared and the wine glasses were half empty. "I'll get dessert," Chloe offered cheerfully, standing up from the table. "Sit down," Martha said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The frail, trembling voice Martha had been using for 3 weeks was completely gone. Her posture was razor straight. Her eyes were locked on Chloe with the cold, unblinking focus of an apex predator. David frowned, confused by the sudden shift in his mother's demeanor. "Mom? What's wrong? Are you feeling confused again?" "I am not confused, David," Martha said smoothly, reaching beneath the dining table. "My memory is flawless. My cognitive functions are in the top 1% for my age bracket, and I have never misplaced my car keys in my entire life." Martha pulled a thick manila folder from her lap and dropped it onto the mahogany dining table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "David, I need you to sit back, keep your mouth closed, and listen to me very carefully," Martha instructed, her voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. She didn't look at her son. Her eyes remained deadlocked on the young woman sitting across from her. Martha opened the folder. She slid a single, stapled document across the polished wood. "3 weeks ago, you handed me a W-2 tax form," Martha said, addressing Chloe directly. "You thought because I was a grieving widow, I wouldn't notice the font discrepancy on your employer identification number. You thought I wouldn't notice that the hospital you claim to work at has no payroll record of you existing for the last 10 years. Chloe's warm smile froze. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. The sweet pediatric nurse vanished, replaced by a calculating, cornered animal. But she didn't speak. She just stared. David nervously reached for the paper. "Mom, what are you talking about? This is crazy." Martha slid a second document across the table. It was a printout from a federal database. "That is the Social Security Death Index," Martha continued, her voice slicing through the quiet room like a scalpel. "The Social Security number you printed on your financial records belongs to a little girl named Emily. Emily was born in 1990. Emily died in a horrific car accident in 1995. You are operating under a stolen synthetic identity. Mom, stop! David shouted, half standing from his chair. You're having an episode. You're paranoid. We need to call the doctor. Sit down, David, Martha snapped, the authority of a 40-year federal investigator bringing her son crashing back into his seat. She slid the third and final document across the table. It was a flow chart of international wire transfers. And then there is Richard, Martha said, leaning forward, resting her forearms on the table. Your supposed estate planner. Richard Vance is a known associate of a money laundering syndicate. His firm routes stolen assets through Delaware Shell LLCs and washes them out in the Cayman Islands. You didn't target David because you loved him. You targeted my son because his father died, because he was lonely, and because I have $1.2 million in liquid retirement assets that you and Richard plan to drain the second I sign that power of attorney. The dining room was dead silent. The evidence was undeniable. It was black and white, stamped with federal seals and IP tracking logs. A normal criminal would have panicked. A normal criminal would have made a run for the front door. But Chloe was not a normal criminal. She was a master of psychological warfare. Chloe didn't look at the documents. She didn't try to defend the tax forms or the dead girl's social security number. Instead, she looked at David. Her lower lip began to tremble. Her breathing hitched. And then, the tears began to fall. It wasn't a fake, dramatic cry. It was a hyperventilating, raw, visceral panic attack. Chloe collapsed out of her dining chair and dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her chest as if she couldn't breathe. David, please, Chloe gasped between violent sobs. She hates me. I knew she hated me because I grew up poor, but I didn't think she was this sick. She hired someone to fabricate these papers. She's trying to destroy us. David instantly dropped to the floor beside her, wrapping his arms around her shaking shoulders. His protective instincts overrode all logic, all reason, and all the undeniable evidence sitting right on the table above him. It's okay, Chloe, I've got you, David said desperately, glaring up at his mother with absolute betrayal and fury. Mom, look what you're doing to her. Your mind is completely gone. You are psychotic. Martha stood up, her heart breaking into a million pieces. She was watching her son choose his abuser over his own mother. David, look at the papers. Look at the death certificate. She is a ghost. I'm not looking at your insane conspiracy theories, David yelled, his voice cracking. He helped Chloe to her feet. We are leaving, and I am filing for medical conservatorship tomorrow. You belong in a facility, Mom. Chloe leaned heavily against David's chest, her face buried in his shirt. But as David turned to grab her coat, Chloe shifted her head just slightly over his shoulder. She looked directly at Martha. The tears were still streaming down her face, but her eyes were dead. The corners of her mouth twitched upward into a microscopic, terrifying smirk. Then Chloe played her ultimate card. She let out a devastating wail and pulled a crumpled piece of glossy paper from her designer handbag. She shoved it into David's hands. I didn't want to tell you like this, Chloe sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I wanted it to be a surprise. But she's trying to tear our family apart before it even begins. David looked down at the paper. It was an ultrasound photo. The color completely drained from David's face. He looked at the tiny black and white image, then at Chloe, and finally at his mother. The anger in his eyes morphed into something much colder. It morphed into absolute hatred. You are dead to me, David whispered to Martha. He wrapped his arm tightly around Chloe, leading the weeping, pregnant woman out the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut, shaking the picture frames on the living room walls. Martha stood completely alone in the echoing silence of her dining room. The evidence of a federal crime was scattered across her table, but it didn't matter. The numbers didn't matter anymore. Chloe hadn't just stolen her son. She had secured the ultimate leverage. Martha was utterly isolated, and the countdown to her total destruction had just begun. There is a profound difference between being alone and being erased. When Robert died, Martha was alone. The house was quiet. The evenings were long. But she was still tethered to the world through her son. But when that heavy oak door slammed shut behind David and Chloe, Martha wasn't just left alone. She was erased. The silence that settled over the 4-bedroom house wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. For the first few days, Martha tried to fight through the brick wall David had thrown up. She called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She texted him screenshots of the federal documents, the fake W-2, the Social Security death index. The messages turned green, meaning she had been completely blocked. She drove to his architecture firm on a Tuesday afternoon, desperate to corner him in the lobby and force him to look at the hard evidence. But the receptionist, looking deeply uncomfortable, refused to let her pass the front desk. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Crawford," the young woman whispered, glancing nervously at the security guard. "David left strict instructions. He said you've been having severe cognitive episodes. He asked us to call him immediately if you showed up so he could contact your doctor. Please don't make me call security." Martha stood in the polished marble lobby, her blood running cold. The narrative had already been planted. Chloe hadn't just poisoned David's mind. She was poisoning his entire professional and social circle. To the world, Martha was no longer a retired forensic accountant. She was a tragic, delusional old woman, aggressively harassing her pregnant daughter-in-law. Martha walked back to her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She drove straight to a diner on the edge of town to meet Marcus. She slid into the vinyl booth across from the private investigator. She didn't order coffee. She just stared at him. "The ultrasound," Martha said flatly. Marcus let out a heavy sigh and pulled a manila envelope from his jacket. "It's a digital forgery, Martha. A highly convincing one, but still a fake. I ran the pixel rendering through a reverse image database. You can buy customized sonogram templates on the dark web, or even on certain novelty websites for less than $50. They add whatever name and date you want. Chloe is not pregnant." Martha closed her eyes. The sheer emotional violence of it was staggering. Chloe had weaponized the one thing David wanted more than anything else in the world, a family, and used it as a human shield. "She played the trump card," Marcus said quietly. "In any conflict between a mother and a pregnant fiancé, the biological imperative of the father will almost always side with the unborn child. It's evolutionary wiring. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't just win the argument. She permanently severed your connection to David." "So what is her next move?" Martha asked, her voice tight. "She has David. She has his trust. Why hasn't she drained his accounts and vanished?" "Because David isn't the real prize," Marcus replied, leaning over the table. "You are. Or rather, your retirement fund is. David's assets are a nice bonus, but that $1.2 million is the jackpot. And now that you are completely isolated, she's going to move into the final phase of the operation. She is going to build a legal paper trail." Martha didn't understand what he meant until 3 nights later. It was 11 p.m. on a Friday. Martha was reading in her living room when flashing red and blue lights painted her front windows. 2 uniformed police officers knocked heavily on her door. Martha opened it, her heart pounding. "Can I help you, officers?" The older officer looked at her with a mixture of authority and pity. "Ma'am, we received a call for a wellness check. Your son reported that you called him in a state of severe confusion, claiming there were strangers in your house and that you didn't know where you were. He was terrified you might have left the stove on or wandered outside." Martha stared at them. Her phone had been sitting on the coffee table all night. She hadn't dialed David's number in over a week. "Officers, I am perfectly fine," Martha said, keeping her voice steady and calm. "I was just reading. I haven't spoken to my son tonight. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." The officers insisted on coming inside. They checked the kitchen. They asked her what year it was, who the president was, and what her date of birth was. Martha answered flawlessly, but the humiliation burned in her throat. The officers eventually apologized for the intrusion and left, noting in their log that she appeared stable but agitated. 2 days later, it happened again. This time it was a call to the fire department reporting a suspected gas leak from an elderly woman who frequently forgot to turn off her oven. Martha realized with absolute horror what Chloe and Richard were doing. They weren't trying to scare her. They were using emergency services to manufacture a documented official history of mental instability. Every time the police or paramedics showed up at her door for a wellness check, a report was filed. A report citing a concerned family member reporting cognitive decline. They were building a wall of legal evidence, brick by brick, and Martha was trapped inside it. The isolation began to take a physical toll. Martha stopped sleeping. She lost weight. The sprawling house felt like a prison cell. Every time a car drove slowly past her window, she braced herself for another police knock. She was entirely cut off from the outside world, living in a constant state of hypervigilance. She was an expert at tracking money, but how do you audit a lie that everyone else believes? The answer arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a certified letter delivered to her front door. Martha signed for the thick, official-looking envelope. She took it to her kitchen island, her hands trembling slightly as she tore it open. It was a formal summons from the state family court. David, acting under the legal guidance of Richard Vance, had officially filed a petition for an emergency medical conservatorship. The document claimed that Martha was suffering from advanced, rapid-onset dementia, accompanied by severe paranoia. It cited the recent police wellness checks as evidence of her inability to care for herself safely. It requested that David be granted immediate, absolute control over her healthcare decisions, her living arrangements, and her entire financial estate. Attached to the back of the petition was a sworn affidavit from Chloe, detailing the heartbreaking abuse and psychotic delusions she had suffered at the hands of her future mother-in-law. If the judge signed this order, Martha wouldn't just lose her money, she would lose her civil rights. David and Richard could legally force her into a locked memory care facility, sell her house, and liquidate her Vanguard accounts without her consent. She had 14 days to appear in court and undergo an independent medical evaluation. 14 days before the ghost erased her completely. Martha looked down at the legal papers. A tear slipped down her cheek, hitting the cold marble countertop. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute to cry for the son she had lost, and for the family that had been weaponized against her. 60 seconds later, she wiped her face. The grieving mother retreated to the shadows, and the IRS forensic accountant stepped back into the light. Chloe wanted a legal war. She was about to get one. Conservatorship is a legal mechanism designed to protect the vulnerable. It allows a trusted family member to step in when an elderly parent can no longer navigate the complexities of daily life. But in the wrong hands, in the hands of a syndicate like Richard Vance's, a conservatorship is not a shield. It is the ultimate weapon of human trafficking. Martha sat at her kitchen island, staring at the petition. The legal jargon was dense, but the objective was crystal clear. David was asking the court to declare her medically incompetent. He was asking for total control over her bank accounts, her real estate, and her medical directives. And buried on page 14 was the most terrifying sentence of all. The petitioner requests authorization to transfer the conservatee to a secure, full-time memory care facility to ensure her physical safety. They weren't just going to take her money, they were going to lock her away. In a secure memory care ward, patients do not have cell phones. They do not have access to the internet. They are often subjected to chemical restraints, heavy sedatives prescribed to keep them compliant. If Martha was locked behind those doors, no one would ever listen to her claims about fake Social Security numbers or offshore wire transfers. She would just be another tragic, raving patient with dementia, and the syndicate would drain her $1.2 million Vanguard account in absolute silence. She had 14 days until the hearing. 14 days to dismantle a trap that had been meticulously built over 6 months. Martha gathered the court documents, put them in a plain tote bag, and drove to Marcus's office in downtown Richmond. When she walked into the private investigator's office, Marcus didn't offer her a seat. He was standing by his window, holding a single sheet of paper. His face was grim, carrying the heavy exhaustion of a man who dealt exclusively in bad news. I pulled the court filings this morning, Martha, Marcus said, turning to face her. Richard Vance isn't playing games. The facility they requested for your transfer is called Whispering Pines. It's a private, locked-down psychiatric facility, and Richard's shell company holds a 30% stake in the parent corporation that owns it. It's a closed loop. They capture the asset, they lock the asset in their own cage, and they liquidate the estate. Then we fight it, Martha said, her voice hard. I will hire the best elder law attorney in the state. I will submit to an independent psychological evaluation. I will pass every cognitive test they throw at me. David is acting on false information, and when I prove I am perfectly sane in front of a judge, this petition falls apart. Marcus looked down at the paper in his hand. He slowly shook his head. You don't understand the legal leverage they have, Martha. It's not just David anymore. Marcus slid the paper across his desk. It wasn't a financial document. It had an official county seal stamped at the top. Martha picked it up. Her eyes scanned the text, and the breath was knocked completely out of her lungs. It was a marriage certificate. They didn't wait for the baby, Marcus said quietly. There was no ceremony, no white dress, no family. They went to the county courthouse 2 weeks ago. Signed, sealed, and legally binding. Martha stared at the names printed on the certificate. David Crawford. And Chloe, using her stolen ghost identity. She is legally his wife, Marcus continued, the brutal reality of the situation laying bare. Do you realize what that means in family court? As his spouse, Chloe now has inherent legal standing over the marital assets. If David is granted conservatorship over you, Chloe inherently gains access to the management of your estate through him. And if anything happens to David, if the stress breaks him, or if he gets into a convenient accident, Chloe inherits everything. The conservatorship, the house, the Vanguard accounts, all of it. Martha dropped the paper onto the desk. The sheer, breathtaking malice of the plan finally crystallized. Chloe had weaponized a fake pregnancy to isolate David. She had weaponized emergency services to manufacture a fake medical history for Martha. And now she had used a courthouse wedding to legally lock herself into the Crawford family bloodline. David was no longer just a manipulated son. He was a legal conduit, a Trojan horse designed to breach Martha's vault. And the moment the judge banged the gavel granting that conservatorship, David's usefulness to the syndicate would expire. Chloe wouldn't just destroy Martha. She would eventually destroy David, too. If we go to court and play defense, we lose, Marcus warned. Richard has unlimited funds. He will bring in paid medical experts who will testify that your paranoia about Chloe's identity is textbook dementia. He will use the police wellness checks. He will put your own son on the stand to testify against you. And Chloe will sit in the gallery, rubbing her fake pregnant belly, playing the terrified victim. The walls of the small office seemed to close in. The legal system, the very institution designed to protect citizens, had been masterfully turned against her. For the first time since this nightmare began, Martha felt the icy grip of true, paralyzing defeat. She looked at the marriage certificate. She looked at the conservatorship petition, the paperwork of her own execution. But as she stared at the documents, the forensic accountant inside her, the woman who had spent 4 decades tearing apart the lies of the most brilliant white-collar criminals in America, woke up. People lie. Emotions lie. Tears lie. But numbers? Numbers always leave a trail. Richard Vance thinks he's an architect, Martha whispered, a dangerous cold clarity washing over her. He thinks because he filed a petition, he controls the board, but he made a mistake. Marcus frowned. What mistake? He got greedy, Martha said, tapping the conservatorship document. He didn't just target my house, he targeted my Vanguard retirement fund. And to liquidate a high-yield, federally regulated retirement account, you don't just need a judge's signature. You need a verified routing network. Richard assumes that because I am an old widow, I am financially passive. Martha stood up. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by a ruthless mechanical focus. Marcus, I need you to set up a meeting with your old contacts at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Specifically, someone who handles interstate wire fraud. Martha, the FBI won't touch a domestic conservatorship dispute, Marcus argued. It's a civil family court matter. It's a civil matter right now, Martha corrected, a razor-sharp smile touching the corners of her mouth. But by the time we walk into that courtroom next week, I am going to make sure Richard Vance commits a federal felony right in front of the judge. She picked up her plain tote bag and walked toward the door. She was done playing the victim. She was done trying to convince her son. The ghost wanted her money. Martha was going to give her exactly what she wanted. And it was going to destroy them all. To catch a predator, you cannot act like prey. You must act like bait. In the world of forensic accounting, there is a maneuver known as the honeypot. It is a decoy, a financial trap designed to look incredibly vulnerable, practically begging to be exploited while secretly being wired with every alarm, tracker, and federal tripwire available. Martha had 14 days until the conservatorship hearing. She didn't spend those days crying. She didn't spend them calling David to beg for his love. She spent them moving her money. Through Marcus, Martha secured a quiet, off-the-books meeting with a special agent from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The agent, a pragmatic man named Reynolds, initially looked at Martha's file with deep skepticism. To the Bureau, a son filing for conservatorship over an aging mother looked like a tragic but entirely legal family dispute. They didn't have the jurisdiction or the manpower to intervene in local probate court. Martha didn't argue. She simply opened her laptop, turned it toward Agent Reynolds, and walked him through the numbers. She showed him the fake W-2. She showed him the Social Security death index matching Chloe's stolen numbers. And then she showed him the routing architecture of Richard Vance's estate planning firm, a web of Delaware shell companies that funneled directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I am not asking the FBI to stop a family court hearing, Martha had told the agent, her voice completely devoid of emotion. I am telling you that in exactly 10 days, a multi-million-dollar international wire fraud syndicate is going to attempt to liquidate my estate. I am going to make my $1.2 million retirement fund completely liquid. I am going to place it in a centralized staging account. And I am going to give Richard Vance the administrative keys. Agent Reynolds had stared at her, stunned by the sheer audacity of the plan. If he clicks transfer on a liquid account, that money is gone in 3 seconds. It crosses international borders, and we will never get it back. He won't get it, Martha said with a terrifyingly calm smile, because you are going to put a federal freeze-frame protocol on the SWIFT routing number. The moment Richard enters his credentials and attempts to move the funds offshore, he triggers a federal felony under the Wire Fraud Act. It won't be a family dispute anymore. It will be a cybercrime committed in real time. The trap was set. For the next week, Martha played her part to perfection. She deliberately logged into her Vanguard account and executed a massive erratic transfer, moving the entirety of her $1.2 million life savings into a new, seemingly unsecured checking trust. To David, who was receiving updates from Richard, this looked exactly like the paranoid, self-destructive behavior of a woman losing her mind. It accelerated their timeline. It gave Richard the ultimate ammunition to prove that Martha was an immediate danger to her own financial survival. To Richard, it looked like a golden goose wandering directly into the slaughterhouse. The money was no longer tied up in mutual funds or delayed withdrawal protocols. It was liquid cash, waiting to be taken. The morning of the mediation arrived. It wasn't held in a sterile courtroom. Because Richard wanted to control the environment, he had arranged for an emergency arbitration at his high-end legal office in downtown Richmond. It was a sprawling, mahogany-lined conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It was designed to intimidate. Martha walked through the glass doors at exactly 9 a.m. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit. She didn't look frail. She didn't look confused, but she kept her hands clasped tightly in front of her, playing the role of a woman desperately trying to hold on to her last shred of dignity. David was already sitting at the massive conference table. He looked horrific. He had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. His posture was slumped, carrying the crushing weight of a son who believed he was putting his mother away for her own good. Sitting right beside him was Chloe. Chloe was wearing a soft, pastel maternity dress. She kept one hand resting protectively over her perfectly flat stomach. When Martha walked in, Chloe let out a soft, rehearsed gasp and leaned into David's shoulder, playing the terrified, traumatized victim. David immediately put his arm around her, glaring at his mother with a mixture of sorrow and bitter resentment. At the head of the table sat Richard Vance. He was flanked by a notary public and a private medical evaluator he had kept on his payroll. Richard's laptop was open in front of him. "Martha," Richard said, his baritone voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Please have a seat. We want to make this as painless as possible." Martha sat down across from her son. The air in the room was suffocatingly tense. Richard pushed a thick stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table. On top of the stack was a silver Mont Blanc pen. "We are here today to execute a voluntary transfer of conservatorship," Richard explained smoothly, looking at Martha with the gentle, condescending gaze of a predator who has cornered its prey. "David is doing this out of love, Martha. Your recent financial behavior, liquidating your entire retirement portfolio without consulting a fiduciary, proves that you are suffering from a severe cognitive decline. If you sign this voluntary surrender, you can avoid a messy public court battle. David will take over your medical care, and my firm will assume immediate administrative control of your newly formed trust to ensure the assets are protected." Protected, washed clean and transferred to the Caymans. Martha looked at the documents. She looked at the silver pen. Then she looked up at her son. "David," Martha said, her voice soft but incredibly clear. "Look at me. Look at your mother." David swallowed hard, refusing to meet her eyes. "Mom, please, just sign it. Chloe can't take this stress anymore. The baby can't take it. You need help, and a locked facility is the only place that can keep you safe from yourself." Martha felt a sharp, agonizing twist in her chest. Her son was completely, entirely broken. He had been brainwashed so thoroughly that he was actively participating in his own mother's destruction. Chloe sniffled softly, dabbing at a non-existent tear with a tissue. "We forgive you, Martha. We just want you to be safe." Martha turned her gaze from her son to the ghost sitting next to him. All the pain, all the grief, all the heartbreak instantly evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating ice of the forensic accountant. "I read the contract, Richard," Martha said, completely ignoring Chloe. She reached out and picked up the silver pen. She held it loosely between her fingers. "Page 9, Section 4. It states that upon my signature, your LLC is granted immediate, irrevocable digital access to my staging account. Is that correct?" Richard smiled patiently. "That is standard procedure for asset protection, Martha. My firm will secure the $1.2 million before you can accidentally wire it to a scammer. We will manage it for your ongoing care." "You already have the account routing numbers queued up on your laptop, don't you?" Martha asked, gesturing slightly to the glowing Apple logo on the back of Richard's computer. "You're just waiting for the ink to dry on this paper to legally authorize the transfer." Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was an incredibly specific question for a woman supposedly suffering from dementia, but greed is a powerful blinder. He was too close to the money to see the tripwire. "Yay, Martha," Richard said smoothly. "The transfer protocol is ready. We are just waiting for your signature to execute the protection order." Martha looked down at the paper. She uncapped the silver pen. Chloe leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed hungrily on Martha's hand. David closed his eyes, unable to watch. Richard's fingers hovered over the keyboard of his laptop, ready to hit enter and vanish $1.2 million into the ether. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the perfect, flawless climax of a 6-month psychological long con. Martha pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line. "You know, Richard," Martha said softly, the pen hovering a millimeter above the paper, "for an estate planner, your compliance protocols are incredibly sloppy." She didn't sign the paper. Instead, Martha set the pen down, reached into her tailored jacket, and pulled out her smartphone. She placed it on the table, screen facing up, and tapped the screen once. The trap sprang. The silver pen lay untouched on the polished mahogany table. Martha's smartphone sat next to it, the screen glowing brightly in the tense, suffocating air of the conference room. Richard Vance stared at the phone, a microscopic flicker of uncertainty crossing his perfectly composed features. Chloe stopped dabbing her fake tears. David just looked exhausted, his head resting heavily in his hands. "What are you doing, Martha?" Richard asked, his tone dropping an octave, losing a fraction of its warm professional gloss. "We don't have time for games. Sign the conservatorship surrender." Martha didn't reach for the pen. She leaned back in her leather chair, her posture radiating absolute, terrifying authority. "I know how your system works, Richard," Martha said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "You isolate the target. You secure the power of attorney. You click a button on your laptop, and the funds are instantly routed through a Delaware LLC shell company before washing out into the Cayman Islands. It's brilliant, really. Fast, clean, and completely untraceable once it crosses international waters." Richard's jaw tightened. "David, your mother is having a paranoid delusion. If she refuses to sign voluntarily, we will have to bring the medical evaluator in and take this to open court." "But there is a fatal flaw in your architecture," Martha continued, completely ignoring Richard's threat. "You assumed I was technologically illiterate. You assumed my $1.2 million was sitting in a standard unsecured Vanguard mutual fund. But a transfer of that magnitude requires a two-factor biometric authentication code, a code that is sent directly to my phone." Martha tapped the screen of her smartphone. A fresh text message popped up. "The authentication code to release the funds is 74921, Martha read aloud. She looked directly into Richard's eyes. "I don't need to sign that piece of paper for you to take my money, Richard. I know you already have the SWIFT transfer queued up on your screen. You're just waiting to hit enter. So go ahead. Enter the code. Take it." David lifted his head, his eyes darting between his mother and his estate planner. "Richard, what is she talking about? What transfer?" Richard didn't answer David. His eyes were locked on Martha. Greed is a disease that blinds even the most calculating predators. He had spent 6 months cultivating this mark. The money was right there. $1.2 million in liquid cash, separated from his offshore account by 5 simple digits. He believed Martha was having a psychological break, a moment of suicidal financial behavior driven by her supposed dementia. He couldn't resist. Richard's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard. He typed 74921. He hit enter. A heavy, absolute silence hung in the room for exactly 3 seconds. Then the Apple logo on the back of Richard's laptop blinked. A harsh, high-pitched error tone erupted from the computer's speakers. Richard frowned, aggressively hitting the trackpad. "What is this? The routing number is bouncing back." Martha smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a federal executioner. "It's bouncing back, Richard, because you didn't just wire money to Delaware," Martha said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You just wired it directly into a secured seizure node monitored by the United States Department of Justice." The color instantly drained from Richard's face. He slammed his laptop shut, jumping up from his leather chair. "That wasn't a retirement account," Martha said, standing up to meet his panic. "That was a federal honeypot. And the moment you hit enter, you bypassed domestic civil court and committed a Class A felony under the Federal Wire Fraud Act. You crossed state and international lines. You just handed them the digital fingerprint of your entire syndicate." Before Richard could even take a step toward the door, the heavy glass doors of the conference room shattered the illusion of his safety. They didn't just open, they were violently forced apart. "FBI! Nobody move! Keep your hands where we can see them!" A half-dozen federal agents flooded the room, their tactical vests dark and imposing. Agent Reynolds stepped through the center, his eyes immediately locking onto Richard. "Richard Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and identity theft," Reynolds barked, as 2 agents slammed the immaculate estate planner against the mahogany table, snapping heavy steel handcuffs over his wrists. Total chaos erupted. The fake medical evaluator bolted for the back exit and was immediately tackled to the floor. But the true tragedy, the absolute devastation of the long con, was happening on the other side of the table. David shot out of his chair in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. He didn't understand the FBI. He didn't understand the wire fraud. All he saw was men with guns swarming the room. His first instinct, his deeply ingrained protective instinct, was to throw himself in front of Chloe. "Stop! Don't touch her!" David screamed, shielding her with his body. "She's pregnant! Please, my wife is pregnant!" An FBI agent grabbed David by the shoulders, pulling him back firmly but without violence. "Step back, sir. Just step back." "Chloe, are you okay?" David yelled, tears of terror streaming down his face. Chloe stood up. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't clutch her stomach in fear. The terrified, weeping, vulnerable pediatric nurse completely vanished. In the span of a single second, the mask shattered. Chloe stood perfectly still, her posture straightening, her face draining of all emotion until it was nothing but a cold, sociopathic blank slate. She looked at the federal agents. She looked at Richard, who was being dragged out the door. And then she looked at David. There was no love in her eyes. There was no fear. There was only the mild, irritated annoyance of a predator who realizes the trap is clamped shut on her own leg. "Chloe," David whispered, his voice breaking. He looked at her flat, emotionless face, the horrifying realization slowly creeping up his spine. "Chloe, the baby, tell them." Chloe reached into her pastel maternity dress. Without a single word, without a shred of empathy, she unstrapped the silicone pregnancy padding she had been wearing for 2 months and let it drop to the floor. It hit the mahogany wood with a dull, hollow thud. She held out her wrists to the approaching federal agent. David's knees buckled. A sound escaped his throat, a visceral, agonizing sound of a man whose entire reality, whose future, whose family, had just been ripped out of his chest and set on fire. He collapsed into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands, sobbing so violently his entire body shook. Martha walked slowly around the table. She didn't look at the ghost in handcuffs being led out the door. She didn't look at the federal agents securing the room. She walked straight to her son. She knelt on the floor beside him. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't demand an apology for the horrible things he had said to her. She just wrapped her arms tightly around his shaking shoulders, pulling his head to her chest, anchoring him the same way she did when he was a little boy waking up from a nightmare. "I've got you," Martha whispered into his hair. "Mom is right here. I'm not going anywhere." 1 year later, the Virginia autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. Martha sat on the front porch of her house, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands. The legal fallout from that day in the conference room had been massive. Richard Vance's laptop provided the FBI with enough encrypted data to dismantle a multi-state network that had preyed on dozens of elderly victims. Richard was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Chloe, whose real name was Sarah Jenkins, a career criminal with 3 prior felony convictions across 2 different states, received 15 years for synthetic identity fraud and elder abuse. The annulment of her marriage to David had been swift and absolute, but justice in a courtroom does not instantly heal the damage done in a home. The psychological toll of narcissistic abuse and severe gaslighting is profound. David had spent the last 12 months in intensive trauma therapy. He had to learn how to trust his own mind again. He had to grieve the loss of a child that never existed and the betrayal of a woman who was nothing more than a carefully engineered mirage. The wall between mother and son hadn't come down overnight. It had taken months of quiet dinners, patient conversations, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding a foundation built on truth rather than manipulation. The screen door creaked open. David stepped out onto the porch, carrying his own mug of coffee. He looked older, quieter, but the heavy, dark shadows under his eyes had finally faded. He sat down in the wicker chair next to Martha. They looked out at the quiet suburban street together. The contractor said the new framing for the downtown project is going up next week, David said, his voice steady, grounded in the reality of his work. That's wonderful, David, Martha smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. They didn't talk about the ghost anymore. They didn't need to. They were survivors, and survivors look forward, not backward. Martha watched a yellow leaf detach from the oak tree in her front yard and drift slowly to the ground. People often believe that monsters hide in the dark. They think the greatest threats to their families are masked strangers breaking windows in the middle of the night. But the most dangerous predators don't wear masks of terror. They wear masks of perfection. They bake pies. They hold your hand. They tell you exactly what your broken heart is desperate to hear. We are taught to lock our doors and secure our windows. But the true vaults we must protect are our minds, our grief, and our families. Love is not blind. It is only when we refuse to see the truth that we become blind. If the numbers don't add up, if the story shifts, if the isolation begins, do not ignore the quiet alarm bell ringing in your gut. Do not let the fear of losing a perfect illusion stop you from protecting the reality you have spent a lifetime building. The greatest asset you will ever own isn't sitting in a bank account. It is your clarity. Guard it relentlessly. Because when the ghost comes knocking, your clarity is the only thing that will keep you and the people you love alive.